The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door while Maya Chun pretended to sleep on the living room couch. She'd given up the bedroom to her daughter weeks ago when the heating stopped working in half the apartment, concentrating what little warmth remained into the single room where Lily could do homework without her breath turning to fog. Maya didn't need to read the paper to know what it said. 72 hours. 3 days to vacate premises due to non-payment of rent. 4 months behind now. $6,400 that might as well have been $6 million for all her ability to produce it. The landlord had been patient, then annoyed, then coldly businesslike. This notice represented the final stage. Legal action, sheriff's involvement, belongings on the sidewalk. She was 38 years old with a master's degree in astrophysics. She couldn't use a daughter who deserved so much better, and $340 in checking account that needed to cover food, utilities, and the impossible mathematics of starting over somewhere cheaper. Somewhere that didn't exist. Not in this city, where even the worst apartments demanded deposits and references and proof of income that exceeded what she earned stocking shelves at a warehouse that paid $14 an hour. Lily stirred in the bedroom, her alarm clock beginning its electronic chirp. 7 years old and already accustomed to waking in apartments that felt temporary, to packing belongings quickly when adults made urgent decisions in hushed voices. Maya had tried to shield her from the worst of their instability, but children absorbed everything. They learned to travel light, to attach themselves to nothing, to expect disappointment as baseline rather than exception. "Mom!" Lily's voice came soft through the thin door. "Is today a normal day?" Normal. What did that word even mean anymore? Normal had died 3 years ago when Christopher walked out, when the research position Maya had sacrificed everything for evaporated in budget cuts, when the PhD that was supposed to guarantee stability became an overqualification that made her unhireable for positions that paid enough to survive. "Yes, sweetie. Normal day. Get dressed for school." Maya folded the eviction notice into precise quarters and tucked it into her jacket pocket where it couldn't be accidentally discovered. Lily didn't need to know yet. Didn't need to spend another day at school carrying the weight of adult problems she couldn't solve. There'd be time enough for explanations when Maya figured out what came next. Breakfast was generic cereal that turned milk gray, the last of the bread toasted dark to hide staleness, and orange juice so diluted it barely tasted like fruit. Lily ate without complaint, the resignation of children who'd learned not to ask for better. She'd stopped requesting the name-brand cereals other kids brought to show and tell, stopped mentioning birthday parties at places that charged admission, stopped wanting in ways that broke Maya's heart more thoroughly than tears ever could. "Madison's mom is taking her to the Space Museum this weekend," Lily said between bites, her tone carefully neutral. "They have a new exhibit about the moon landing." Maya's chest tightened. Lily loved space with the pure passion of children who decided their future before the world taught them to lower expectations. She drew rockets in her notebooks, checked out library books about astronauts, talked about Mars colonies and distant galaxies with the certainty of someone who believed dreams came true if you wanted them hard enough. "That sounds wonderful," Maya managed, knowing she couldn't afford the $28 admission fee, couldn't spare the gas money, couldn't take time off work even if she could somehow produce the cash. "Maybe we can watch a documentary instead. The library has good ones." Lily's face performed the micro-adjustment children mastered when learning to accept disappointment gracefully. A slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional downer to the mouth, then the practice smile that said she understood. It was fine, she didn't mind. "Yeah, documentaries are good too." The mail slot rattled as the postal carrier delivered the day's collection of bills and advertisements. Maya gathered the envelopes mechanically, sorting past due notices from credit card offers designed for people whose credit hadn't already collapsed into unsalvageable territory. Most of it went directly into the recycling bin. She couldn't afford to pay what she owed. Reading reminders only sharpened the blade of her failure. But one envelope stood out. Heavier stock than the rest, official seal in the corner, return address from a law firm in New Mexico she'd never heard of, Sterling and Reyes, attorneys at law, specializing in estate settlement and property transfer. Maya opened it standing in the kitchen while Lily brushed her teeth in the bathroom, the sound of running water providing cover for whatever this letter might contain. Legal correspondence had never brought good news. Divorce papers, custody arrangements, notification of debt collections proceeding to judgment. Every official envelope in her adult life had delivered fresh disaster. The letter inside used language that danced around clarity, legal prose designed to convey information while disclaiming emotional stake in its content. Dear Ms. Maya Rinshi-chan, during the systematic digitization of mid-20th century research facility transfer records, our office has identified an unclaimed property deed associated with the Moonbeam Lunar Research Initiative, a privately funded astronomical research program operational from 1968 to 1974. The deed concerns a facility structure constructed during the program's active period and legally registered under the name Dr. Evelyn Rinshi, deceased 1989. According to records recently recovered from archived federal scientific grant documentation, this deed was issued but never delivered to its intended recipient due to the closure of the USPS regional office responsible for the delivery route. As the verified descendant of Dr. Evelyn Rinshi, you are hereby notified that this property legally remains under your family's ownership. The facility location is documented in attached coordinates, approximately 47 miles northwest of Alamogordo, New Mexico, in an area formerly designated for private astronomical research. Maya read the letter 3 times, convinced she'd misunderstood something fundamental. Her grandmother, Dr. Evelyn Rinshi, had been a radio astronomer in the 1960s and 70s, one of the few women in her field working on projects Maya's family spoke about only vaguely. Research in New Mexico was how her mother described it, with a dismissive tone that suggested work better forgotten than celebrated. Evelyn had died when Maya was 10, a stern figure in Maya's few childhood memories, someone who'd chosen science over family warmth, who'd lived alone in distant places, pursuing projects no one fully understood. Her grandmother's funeral had been small, attended mostly by colleagues who spoke in technical language about signal analysis and radio telescope arrays, and contributions to fields Maya had been too young to comprehend. No one had mentioned property. No one had suggested Evelyn owned anything beyond personal effects that had been liquidated to cover end-of-life medical expenses. Her mother, Margaret, had received a small life insurance payout, maybe $15,000, and some scientific equipment sold to universities for amounts that barely covered funeral costs. A research facility in New Mexico, owned by her grandmother, legally, for more than 50 years. The letter continued with bureaucratic explanation. The deed had been sent through USPS regional office that later closed due to financial collapse in 1976. Mail from that period had been stored, moved, lost during jurisdictional consolidations. During recent archival digitization ahead of building demolition, sealed mail bags have been discovered containing hundreds of undelivered documents, most obsolete. This particular deed remained legally valid. Attached to the letter were photocopied documents, the original property deed showing Dr. Evelyn Rinshi as owner, a hand-drawn map with coordinates marked in faded ink, and a black and white photograph so degraded by time that details blurred into abstraction. Maya held the photograph up to the kitchen light, squinting to make sense of the shapes. A structure, definitely, but unlike any building she'd expected. Cylindrical, maybe 30 feet tall, narrow relative to its height, with what looked like a dome or a spherical element at the top. Behind it stretched empty desert, mountains in the far distance, and a sky bleached white by age and photographic limitations. Her grandmother stood beside the structure, tiny in comparison, wearing practical work clothes and holding what might have been surveying equipment. Even through the photograph's degradation, something about Evelyn's posture suggested determination, defiance, maybe the body language of someone who'd built something difficult and refused to apologize for it. Lily emerged from the bathroom, backpack already strapped to her shoulders, ready for the walk to school that started too early and ended too late because Maya's work schedule didn't align with childhood logistics. "What's that?" Maya folded the letter quickly, instinct protecting her daughter from hope that might collapse into disappointment. Just mail. Nothing important. You look weird, though. Like surprised weird, not bad weird. Children noticed everything, absorbed emotional currents adults thought they'd hidden. Maya forced her expression into something more neutral, manufacturing calm she didn't feel. I'm fine, sweetie. Come on, we need to go or you'll be late. They walked the 6 blocks to school through morning cold that bit through inadequate jackets. Maya had given Lily her better coat 2 weeks ago, claiming she preferred lighter layers, lying with the smooth ease of mothers who'd learned to sacrifice invisibly. Lily chattered about an upcoming science project, about her teacher's promise that the best projects would be displayed in the school library, about her plan to build a model of the solar system using painted styrofoam balls. Can we get the supplies this weekend? Mrs. Patterson said we need to start soon. We'll see. The non-answer parents employed when no felt too cruel, but yes, required resources they didn't have. Styrofoam balls and paint and poster board added up to maybe $20, a sum that shouldn't feel impossible, but currently exceeded Maya's capacity to produce. At the school entrance, Lily hugged her quickly, a perfunctory gesture of affection from a child already learning to protect herself from attachment that might require leaving when circumstances demanded moving again. Maya watched her daughter disappear into the building, then stood for a moment in the empty street, feeling the eviction notice in one pocket and the letter about her grandmother's property in the other. 2 pieces of paper, one promising displacement, the other suggesting possibility. Together, they created an equation Maya didn't know how to solve. She should go to work, clock in for her warehouse shift, spend 8 hours moving boxes and accepting orders from supervisors half her age who treated education as threat rather than asset. She should focus on accumulating the paycheck that would barely cover a week's expenses, should start researching cheaper apartments in worse neighborhoods, should be practical. Instead, Maya found herself walking to the public library, the letter clutched in her hand, a plan forming that felt simultaneously desperate and necessary. The library opened at 9. Maya waited on the steps, watching the city wake around her, counting down minutes until she could access computers with internet research capabilities her phone's limited data plan made impossible. When the doors unlocked, she rushed to the nearest available terminal, logged in with the guest credentials that gave her 2 hours of access, and began searching. Moonbeam Lunar Research Initiative. Dr. Evelyn Rinchi. Alamogordo Astronomical Research Facilities. The search returned fragments, scattered references in academic papers, and declassified government documents and historical archives maintained by universities. The Moonbeam Initiative had been a private research program funded by a coalition of wealthy science enthusiasts during the height of the space race. Its goal: analyzing lunar surface composition using advanced radio telescope arrays and spectral analysis techniques that were cutting-edge for 1968. Dr. Evelyn Rinchi had been lead researcher, one of few women in positions of scientific authority during that era. The program had operated from 1968 to 1974, producing research papers that contributed to NASA's understanding of lunar geology. Then funding had dried up as public interest shifted, grants evaporated, and the space race concluded with Apollo missions that made ground-based lunar analysis seem less urgent. The facility had been abandoned, research equipment presumably sold or transferred to universities, the site left to desert reclamation. But nowhere in the historical record was there mention of the property deed itself being transferred or the facility ownership changing hands. The land had simply been forgotten, filed away in bureaucratic systems that lost track of assets that generated no tax revenue and attracted no attention. Maya pulled up satellite imagery of the coordinates listed in the letter. The map loaded slowly on the library's ancient computers, pixelating and resolving in frustrating increments. When it finally displayed, she zoomed in on terrain that looked like every desert landscape: brown earth, scrub vegetation, dirt roads that probably hadn't seen maintenance in decades. And there, exactly where the coordinates indicated, a small irregular shape that didn't match natural geology. Man-made, still standing. Her grandmother's research facility. Real. Existing. Waiting. Maya's hands trembled as she printed the satellite images. Paying 25 cents per page from the change she'd been saving for Lily's science project supplies. She printed the legal documents, the historical references, everything that proved this wasn't imagination or desperate fantasy, but documented reality. By the time she left the library, she'd spent 2 hours and $3.75 in printing fees and accumulated a stack of papers that felt heavier than their physical weight suggested. She walked to work in a daze, barely registering the familiar route, mind churning through implications. A research facility in New Mexico. 53 years abandoned. Legally hers. Her shift supervisor noticed her distraction immediately. Maya had been reliable until recently, the kind of employee who showed up consistently and worked efficiently, but economic desperation had eroded her performance. Too many nights without adequate sleep. Too much mental energy devoted to impossible mathematics of survival. Too much fear about tomorrow to focus properly on today. Chun, you're on automated sorting again. Try to keep your mind on the work, yeah? We had complaints about your accuracy last week. Maya nodded, moved to her station, let her body perform movements muscle memory had mastered while her mind returned again and again to the letter. The facility was hers. Legally, officially, irrevocably hers. But what did that mean practically? She couldn't afford the gas money to drive to New Mexico, couldn't take time off work to investigate property she might not even be able to access. And even if she somehow reached the facility, what would she find? An abandoned research building in terminal decay, equipment long since vandalized or weather damage beyond value, a structure that would cost more to demolish than any land value it might represent. No one else knew about this. No one had come forward in 50 years to claim the property or contest her grandmother's ownership, which either meant the facility had no value anyone recognized, or was so remote and forgotten that institutional memory had erased its existence completely. During her lunch break, Maya called the law firm listed on the letter. A paralegal answered with practiced efficiency, confirmed the documents were legitimate, explained that her grandmother's estate had never been fully settled because no one had known assets existed to settle. The facility was built with private research grant funding, which typically reverts to the grantee organization upon project completion. But in this case, the deed was issued directly to Dr. Ren Shi as principal investigator and primary researcher. That was unusual for the era, but not unprecedented. The granting organization dissolved in 1978, so there's no entity to contest ownership. What about taxes? Maya asked, the practical question cutting through optimism. If the property's been sitting there for 50 years, surely there are decades of back taxes owed. New Mexico has interesting laws regarding abandoned research facilities on federal land leases. The Moonbeam initiative operated under a special designation for scientific research that exempted it from standard property taxation during the active research period. After abandonment, the property should have reverted to federal oversight, but the paperwork was never processed. It's been in legal limbo for 5 decades. So I own it, but I also might not own it. You own it subject to federal review of the historical documentation. But given that we're talking about a defunct research facility with no commercial value, no environmental hazards flagged in historical records, and no competing claims in over half a century, federal interest is minimal. They're unlikely to contest unless you try to develop the land commercially. The paralegal paused, papers rustling in the background. Ms. Chun, I should mention that our firm has received an inquiry about this property. A development company called Celestial Properties, LLC contacted us 3 days ago asking about acquisition. They're aware of the deed discovery and are interested in purchasing should you decide to sell. Maya's pulse quickened. How much are they offering? They suggested $950 as a starting point for what they termed a property with unclear utility and significant renovation costs. $950. For land, for a building, for a piece of her family history, someone wanted enough to make an offer within days of the deed surfacing. That meant value existed beyond what was immediately apparent. That meant whoever ran Celestial Properties knew something about the facility that Maya didn't. Tell them I need time to consider. Certainly, though I should inform you that development companies typically move quickly when they've identified properties of interest. If you delay, the offer may decrease or be withdrawn entirely. After disconnecting, Maya sat in the warehouse break room, staring at vending machines she couldn't afford to use, trying to understand what had just happened. Someone wanted her grandmother's forgotten research facility. Wanted it enough to offer money, however insulting the amount, within 72 hours of the deed becoming public record. That meant something was there. Something worth pursuing, worth investigating, worth the risk of a desperate journey to New Mexico with a 7-year-old daughter and $340 in the bank. The eviction notice had given her 72 hours. She had a car that might survive 1,300 miles if she babied it and prayed. She had a daughter who deserved stability but had learned to live with chaos. And she had a choice: accept $950 for property she'd never seen, or refuse and discover why someone wanted it badly enough to make that offer. That evening, Maya sat Lily down in the kitchen of the apartment they'd be forced to leave in 3 days. She spread the documents across the table: the deed, the photographs, the satellite images, the eviction notice she could no longer hide. We need to talk about what happens next. Lily's face performed its practiced adjustment, preparing for disappointment. We're moving again. Yes, but maybe not the way you think. I want to show you something. Maya explained about her grandmother, about the research facility, about the letter that had arrived that morning offering impossible possibility. She watched Lily's expression transform from resigned acceptance to cautious interest to something approaching excitement. Your grandma studied the moon. She analyzed radio signals bouncing off the lunar surface, trying to understand what the moon was made of, how it formed, whether there were resources humans could use. And she had a whole building for that, just for studying space. A whole facility, with equipment I don't completely understand. But it's real, Lily. It's ours. And someone wants to buy it from us for almost nothing, which means it's worth more than almost nothing. Lily absorbed this with the seriousness of children who'd learned that adult decisions shape their lives in ways beyond their control. What if we went there? What if we saw it before you sold it? That's 1,300 miles. Our car might not make it. We'd have to pack everything we own, leave here with no backup plan, drive across half the country hoping to find a building that's been abandoned for 50 years. But what if there's something good there? What if Grandma Evelyn left something important? Maya looked at her daughter, at the hope blooming in her face, at the possibility that this moment might teach her something valuable about taking chances when life demanded courage. She thought about the eviction notice, about the warehouse job that would never pay enough, about the PhD gathering metaphorical dust while she sorted boxes. She thought about her grandmother, Evelyn Runshee, who'd built something alone in the desert when women weren't supposed to build things, who'd chosen science over social approval, who'd left behind a structure that had waited 53 years to be rediscovered. Okay, Maya heard herself say. We'll go. We'll see what your great-grandmother built, and then we'll decide what happens next. They left before dawn on Thursday, everything they owned packed into Maya's 2004 Honda Civic with 180,000 miles and mechanical protests that grew louder with each additional box. Clothing, books, Lily's stuffed animals that had survived multiple moves, the few kitchen items Maya couldn't bear to abandon. Nothing extra, nothing that couldn't be replaced if circumstances demanded it. The landlord would find an empty apartment. The warehouse would receive no notice. Maya's phone number would disconnect when she couldn't pay the bill. She was burning every bridge, abandoning what little stability she'd managed to construct, betting everything on a building she'd never seen and property rights that might not survive federal scrutiny. They drove west through sunrise, then through midday heat, then through afternoon that stretched into evening. Lily slept for long stretches, woke to eat gas station snacks purchased with ruthless budgeting, watched landscape transform from urban density to rural emptiness to desert terrain that looked like Mars imagined through Earth geology. The car's temperature gauge climbed worryingly as they crossed into New Mexico. Maya nursed it through mountain passes, coasted downhill where possible, kept speed moderate to reduce engine strain. Every mechanical sound became potential catastrophe. Every warning light a countdown to disaster. They stopped for the night at a roadside rest area, parking beneath sodium lights that buzzed with electrical consistency, sleeping in the car with windows cracked for ventilation and doors locked against uncertainty. Maya dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check that Lily was safe, that no one had approached, that morning would arrive without crisis. At dawn, they continued. The GPS coordinates from her grandmother's deed led them past Alamogordo, onto progressively smaller roads, then onto dirt tracks that tested the Honda suspension beyond reasonable limits. Dust billowed around them. Scrub brush scraped the car's undercarriage. The landscape opened into emptiness that felt ancient and absolute. "Mom, are you sure we're going the right way?" Maya checked her phone for the 100th time, watching the GPS pin that marked their destination grow closer with painful slowness. According to this, we're close. Maybe 2 more miles. The track curved around a low hill, and suddenly the facility appeared. Not gradually, not with the slow revelation of things built to be seen. It simply was, as though the desert had hidden it intentionally and only now consented to acknowledge its presence. Maya stopped the car 50 yards from a structure, unable to process what she was seeing. The photograph hadn't prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared her for this. The facility rose from the desert floor like something that had grown rather than been built. Cylindrical, yes, but the photograph hadn't captured the scale. 40 feet tall, maybe more, constructed from what looked like reinforced concrete that had weathered to a color indistinguishable from the surrounding earth. The surface showed decades of exposure, cracks spiderwebbing across sections, discoloration where water had run during rare desert rains, patches where wind-driven sand had abraded the finish to raw aggregate. But it stood, solidly, impossibly, defiantly stood. The dome at the top was larger than the photograph suggested, a spherical element maybe 15 feet in diameter, constructed from what appeared to be metal panels riveted together with industrial precision. Rust had claimed sections of it, orange-brown blooms spreading across silvered surfaces. But the structure remained intact, sealed, maintained by nothing more than the desert's dry preservation and engineering that had anticipated decades of abandonment. Around the main cylinder, Maya could see the remnants of what must have been the broader research complex. Foundations marked where other buildings had stood, now reduced to concrete slabs and twisted rebar. Equipment housings lay scattered, their contents long since removed or dissolved by weather. Power line conduits emerged from the ground like skeletal fingers, leading nowhere, connecting to nothing. But the main structure, the beam chamber, Maya realized, recognizing it now from descriptions in the research paper she'd found, had survived intact. Lily pressed her face against the car window, eyes wide with wonder that transcended the caution children learned from repeated displacement. "Mom, it's huge. It's like a rocket that decided to stay on the ground. It's a beam chamber for focusing and analyzing radio telescope signals." Maya's voice came out steadier than she felt, drawing on academic knowledge to ground herself against the surreal reality of standing before her grandmother's work. "Your great-grandmother built this to study moon rocks without ever touching them. She bounced radio signals off the lunar surface and analyzed what came back." "Can we go inside?" Maya studied the structure, looking for obvious hazards. No immediate signs of structural collapse. The concrete showed stress cracks, but nothing suggesting imminent failure. The dome's metal panels had rusted, but remained attached to their framework. A single door, industrial and heavy, marked the entrance at ground level, closed but not obviously locked. They approached on foot, Maya keeping Lily close, testing the ground for stability before committing weight. The desert here was hard, packed, vegetation sparse, the kind of terrain that changed slowly across decades. Whatever landscaping might have existed during the facility's operational years had long since surrendered to natural reclamation. Up close, the structure revealed details the photographs and satellite images had missed. Someone had carved text into the concrete near the door, letters formed with careful precision by tools designed for harder work. Moonbeam Lunar Research Initiative Dr. Evelyn Renshaw, Principal Investigator 1968 below that, in smaller script that looked added later. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. JFK, and below that, in handwriting that must have been scratched into the concrete while it was still curing. For those who come after, look up, look far, look beyond what others say is possible. Maya traced the letters with her fingertips, feeling the grooves worn slightly smooth by 50 years of wind-blown sand. Her grandmother had stood here, had pressed these words into concrete that would outlast her, had believed the facility mattered enough to demand permanence. The door's handle was a heavy industrial lever, the kind designed for use with gloved hands in scientific environments. Maya tested it gently, expecting rust or seized mechanisms. Instead, it moved smoothly, well-engineered bearings still functional despite decades of neglect. Your great-grandmother built things to last, Maya murmured, putting weight behind the lever. The door swung inward with a groan of metal on metal, revealing darkness that smelled of dust and concrete and something else. Ozone maybe, or the particular scent of electronics long dormant. Cool air spilled out, noticeably colder than the desert exterior, suggesting insulation that still functioned and thermal mass that absorbed temperature changes slowly. Maya pulled out her phone, activated the flashlight, and stepped across the threshold. Lily followed close behind, one hand gripping the back of Maya's jacket with the instinctive caution of children entering unknown spaces. The interior revealed itself in the phone's limited light. They stood in what must have been the ground-level operations room, a circular space perhaps 30 feet in diameter. The concrete walls curved seamlessly, broken only by doorways leading to what looked like storage areas and equipment rooms. Heavy cables ran along the walls in organized bundles, terminating at junction boxes whose purposes Maya could only guess. But what dominated the space was the column rising through the center. Not structural. The building's load-bearing elements were clearly the outer walls, but functional. A cylinder maybe 6 feet in diameter, running from floor to ceiling and presumably continuing upward through the building's full height. Its surface was smooth metal, broken at regular intervals by what looked like access panels and instrumentation ports. The beam column, Maya breathed, recognition clicking into place. This is where the radio telescope signals were focused. They collect data from the lunar surface and channel it through this central column for analysis. The whole building is basically a giant instrument designed around this one piece. Lily moved closer to the column, drawn by the same curiosity that had made her grandmother legendary in her field. Does it still work? I doubt it. Equipment like this needs power, maintenance, calibration. It's been sitting here for 50 years. But even as she said it, Maya noticed details that suggested the facility hadn't been as thoroughly abandoned as she'd assumed. The floor, though dusty, showed no signs of animal intrusion or severe weather damage. The cables remained intact, their insulation uncracked despite age. The junction boxes were closed properly, sealed against the elements by someone who'd understood the importance of protection even in abandonment. They explored the ground level methodically, Maya documenting everything with her phone's camera. Equipment rooms held empty racks where computers and analysis instruments had once lived. Storage areas contained nothing but shelving and the ghosts of organizational systems. A small office area, Evelyn's certainly, retained a desk and filing cabinets, both empty, their contents removed during decommissioning. But on the desk, someone had left a photograph in a simple frame. The glass had survived unbroken, protecting an image that made Maya's breath catch. Evelyn Renshaw, younger than in any photo Maya had seen, standing beside a man Maya didn't recognize. They wore lab coats and genuine smiles, holding between them what looked like a commendation or certificate, too small in the photo to read clearly. Lily picked up the frame carefully. Is that your grandma? Yes. I don't know who the man is. Another researcher, probably. She looks happy. Not like the pictures Mom showed me, where she looked scary. Maya's mother had described Evelyn as cold, distant, someone who'd chosen career over family connection and paid for that choice with loneliness. But this photograph told a different story. Evelyn looked proud, accomplished, surrounded by colleagues who respected her work. Happy in a way Maya's mother had either never seen or refused to acknowledge. A stairway in the corner led upward, metal treads that rang hollowly under their feet. Maya tested each step before allowing Lily to follow, conscious that structural failure at height could be catastrophic. But the stairs held firm, bolted into the concrete walls with engineering that anticipated decades of use. The second level opened into a space that took Maya's breath away. Where the ground floor had been functional and utilitarian, this level was designed for observation and analysis. Windows ringed the circular space, each one positioned to provide views of the surrounding desert and sky. The glass had survived intact, sealed by frames that had protected them from the worst of weather damage. But what dominated the space was the equipment. Unlike the ground floor, which had been stripped during decommissioning, this level retained its instruments. Oscilloscopes sat on workbenches, their screens dark but intact. Analog recording devices lined one wall, their tape reels still threaded. A massive chart recorder occupied an entire section, paper yellowed with age, but still showing the last data it had captured, wave patterns and frequency analyses that meant nothing to Maya, but would have told her grandmother volumes about lunar surface composition. They left everything, Maya whispered, moving between workstations like someone walking through a museum. When they decommissioned the facility, they removed the computers and modern equipment, but left the analog instruments. Why would they do that? Maybe because analog equipment had no resale value by 1974. Or maybe because someone knew this represented something worth preserving, even if they couldn't justify maintaining an entire facility. Lily had found a logbook on one of the workbenches, its pages stiff with age, but readable. She flipped through carefully, running her finger along entries written in precise, scientific notation mixed with personal observations. June 12, 1971. Signal clarity excellent tonight. Detected anomaly in mare tranquillitatis reflection patterns. Requires further analysis. June 13, 1971. Anomaly persists. Signal strength suggests subsurface density variation inconsistent with known lunar geology. June 14, 1971. Contacted Houston regarding anomaly. They're skeptical but interested. Recommended additional observation runs. The entries continued for pages, documenting weeks of observation, analysis, correspondence with NASA and university researchers. Then, abruptly, the tone changed. August 3, 1971. Houston has requested we discontinue anomaly investigation. Resources needed elsewhere. Funding review upcoming. August 15, 1971. Funding cut by 40%. Staff reductions necessary. May need to scale back observation schedule. November 2, 1971. Spoke with Dr. Patterson about preservation protocols. If facility closes, we need to ensure data survives. Core samples and primary observation logs will be secured. Maya read over Lily's shoulder, piecing together the story. Funding pressures, political shifts in scientific priorities, the slow strangulation of projects that didn't serve immediate goals. Her grandmother had fought to keep the facility operational, had documented everything with the discipline of someone who knew institutional memory was fragile and work could be erased by bureaucratic indifference. The logbook's final entry came in February 1974. Final observation run complete. Equipment powered down. Core samples and primary data logs secured in the beam chamber vault for future research. Coordinates logged. Access code sealed. May whoever finds this understand what we were trying to accomplish. Vault? Lily looked up from the logbook. What vault? Maya's heart began to race. She looked at the beam column rising through the center of this level, at the access panels she'd noticed earlier, at the structure's design that suddenly made more sense. The column wasn't just a signal conduit. It was also storage. A sealed, climate-controlled environment protected by the building's thermal mass and structural integrity. They returned to the ground floor, Maya examining the beam column with new attention. The access panels were secured with bolts that had rusted slightly but remained intact. No locks, surprisingly, just mechanical fasteners that could be removed with tools if you knew they were there. Lily checked the storage rooms. Look for a toolbox, anything with wrenches or socket sets. While Lily searched, Maya studied the access panel closest to ground level. Standard industrial construction, meant to be serviced but not frequently accessed. The bolt heads showed where patterns consistent with occasional opening during the facility's operational period, then decades of stillness. Lily returned with a toolbox that had somehow survived scrappers and time, its contents rusted but functional. Maya selected a socket wrench, fitted it to the first bolt, and pulled. The initial resistance seemed absolute, metal fused by oxidation. Then something gave, the bolt rotating with a screech that echoed through the empty facility. One bolt, then another, then 6 more, each requiring effort, but ultimately yielding to patience and leverage. The access panel came free with a sound like breaking vacuum seal, revealing an interior space darker than the building's ambient gloom. Maya aimed her phone light into the opening. The beam column's interior was perhaps 4 feet square, running vertically through the building's full height. Metal shelving lined the walls, and on those shelves, oh my God, storage containers. Dozens of them, sealed in aluminum cases designed for long-term preservation. Each one labeled in Evelyn's precise handwriting. Lunar Course Sample Analysis, Mare Tranquillitatis, June-August 1971. Spectral Data, Anomaly Region Alpha, Primary Observation Set. Radio Telescope Calibration Logs, 1968 to 1974. These were the facility's research outputs. Everything Evelyn had considered worth preserving. Everything she believed might matter to future researchers, secured in a vault designed to survive decades of abandonment. But Maya's flashlight caught something else at the column's base. Not an aluminum case. A wooden box, smaller, personal rather than scientific. She reached in carefully, extracted it, and found it surprisingly heavy. The wood had warped slightly with age, but remained intact, sealed with brass hinges gone green with patina. Lily crowded close. "What's in it?" Maya set the box on a nearby workbench, examining the simple clasp that held it closed. No lock, just a latch and the understanding that whoever opened this was meant to be here. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had preserved them from moisture and dust, were objects that told a story beyond scientific data. Photographs, dozens of them, documenting the facility's construction. Evelyn in work clothes, directing crane operators. Evelyn with her research team, faces bright with excitement. The beam chamber during various construction phases, rising from desert floor to completed structure. But beneath the photographs were things more personal. Letters, tied with ribbon, now brittle with age. Maya lifted them carefully, recognized addresses from her mother, from family members she'd never known. Letters sent to Evelyn during her years at the facility, correspondence that suggested connection despite the geographic distance and professional focus that had defined her grandmother's life. One letter in particular, addressed to Evelyn from someone named David Patterson, caught Maya's attention. She unfolded it carefully. "Dear Evelyn, I know you disagree with the decision to close Moonbeam, and I understand your frustration. But funding realities leave us no choice. The work you've done here matters, perhaps more than either of us can fully appreciate now. The anomaly data alone represents years of potential research. I've arranged for the core samples and primary logs to be secured in the beam chamber, as we discussed. Houston doesn't need to know the details. Sometimes preservation matters more than politics. What we discovered about the lunar surface composition will eventually be recognized as significant. The density variations you documented in Mare Tranquillitatis suggest resources we're only beginning to understand. Rare earth elements, potentially. Water ice in unexpected locations. The moon isn't dead rock. It's a treasure we haven't learned to value yet. Keep the coordinates safe. Keep the access protocols recorded. When funding cycles turn, and they will, someone will want this data. Someone will understand what you were trying to accomplish. Your friend and colleague, David. The letter was dated March 1974, weeks before the facility's final closure. Maya read it twice, then a third time, the implications crystallizing. The anomaly Evelyn had detected. The density variations. Resources in unexpected locations. Her grandmother hadn't just been studying the moon's surface. She'd been mapping its valuable elements, documenting rare Earth deposits and water ice that wouldn't be commercially relevant for decades. Research that in 1974 was purely academic, but in 2027 represented fortunes waiting to be claimed by whoever held the data first. Mom, there's more boxes down here. Maya looked into the beam column vault, her flashlight revealing additional containers she'd missed in her initial survey. Larger cases, marked with different labels. Lunar resource mapping, phases 1 to 3. Rare earth element distribution analysis. Water ice location protocols. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the first case, broke the seal, and found data logs that documented years of observation. Maps showing lunar coordinates cross-referenced with spectral analysis. Handwritten notes explaining detection methodologies. Calculations estimating resource concentrations based on signal reflection patterns. This was worth more than a forgotten research facility. This was worth more than $950 from a development company. This was potentially worth millions. Data that private space companies and government agencies would pay extraordinary sums to access. Information that could guide lunar mining operations and resource extraction for decades. Lily, help me get these cases out. All of them. We need to see what we have. They worked together for the next hour, extracting container after container from the beam chamber vault. Maya's phone battery dwindled as she photographed labels and cataloged contents. 43 cases total, ranging from small document boxes to large aluminum containers designed for delicate instruments. When they finally stopped, the ground floor of the facility looked like an archive in mid-excavation. Cases stacked carefully, organized by category, documented with photos that would prove authenticity. Maya sat on the concrete floor, Lily beside her, both covered in dust and overwhelmed by what they discovered. Your great-grandmother was brilliant, Maya said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly. Vindication for a woman who'd been dismissed as cold and obsessed, but also grief for opportunities lost, for research abandoned before its value was understood, for grandmother Maya had never truly known. Lily picked up one of the photographs, studying Evelyn's face with the intensity of children trying to understand family history. She looks like you. Same eyes. Maya had never noticed the resemblance, had never looked past her mother's descriptions of Evelyn as someone to avoid emulating, someone whose choices led to loneliness and regret. But now, seeing her grandmother in this context, understanding what she'd accomplished and how carefully she'd preserved it, Maya saw the connection Lily had identified immediately. Same determination, same refusal to accept limitations others imposed, same belief that work could matter more than comfort. That contribution transcended personal cost. We need to understand what we have, Maya said, pulling out her phone despite its low battery. These cases contain research data from a pioneering lunar analysis program. If even half of what David Patterson's letter suggests is true, this information is valuable to current space exploration initiatives. She began searching, battery percentage dropping with each query. Lunar rare earth elements commercial value. Water ice moon mining applications. Moonbeam lunar research initiative historical significance. The results came quickly, painting a picture that confirmed her emerging theory. The moon's rare earth elements, materials crucial for electronics manufacturing and renewable energy technology, were worth approximately $500 billion in accessible deposits, according to current surveys. Water ice at the lunar poles, necessary for supporting permanent moon bases and producing rocket fuel, represented strategic value beyond monetary calculation. And the companies racing to claim these resources, SpaceX, Blue Origin, smaller private ventures. We're all working from data gathered by modern satellites and rovers. Data that cost hundreds of millions to collect. Data that Evelyn Renshie had begun mapping in 1971 using radio telescope arrays and analytical techniques that, while primitive by current standards, had identified anomalies no one else had thought to investigate. This is what Celestial Properties wanted, Maya said aloud, understanding clicking into place. They knew about the research. Someone discovered that Moonbeam had collected valuable data before closing. They've been waiting for the deed to surface so they could buy the property before anyone realized what the facility contained. Lily's face showed confusion, the explanation requiring context beyond her current understanding. Maya simplified. Your great-grandmother left us something more valuable than a building. She left us information that people need and will pay a lot of money to access. How much money? Maya thought about the research papers she'd found, about commercial licensing fees for scientific data, about the current market value of lunar resource mapping information. Conservative estimates suggested millions. Optimistic projections went higher. But exact numbers mattered less than the fundamental truth. They weren't homeless anymore. They weren't trapped by poverty and impossible choices. Enough money that we don't have to worry about rent. Enough that you can go to the Space Museum whenever you want. Enough that we can build a real life instead of just surviving. The sun was setting when they finally emerged from the facility, Maya's phone dead, despite her attempts to preserve battery. They sat on the concrete steps in front of the beam chamber, watching desert colors deepen into purples and oranges as daylight failed. The facility cast a long shadow across terrain that looked unchanged since Evelyn's time, permanent in ways that transcended human timescales. Lily leaned against her mother's shoulder, comfortable in silence that had become familiar over years of learning to be two people against everything else. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the kind of simple wisdom that children sometimes access before adults taught them to complicate everything. Great-grandma Evelyn wasn't mean. She was busy doing important work. Mom said she chose science over family, but maybe she chose science for family. For us. For people she'd never meet but thought deserved something good. Maya felt tears on her face, hot and unexpected, the first she'd allowed herself to cry since the eviction notice arrived. Lily was right. Evelyn hadn't. Abandoned family through selfishness or coldness. She'd built something that outlasted her, something that waited 53 years to provide exactly what her descendants needed when they needed it most. The moon rose over the desert as temperature dropped, and stars emerged with the crystalline clarity that only empty places allowed. Maya looked up, found the mare Tranquillitatis region her grandmother had obsessed over, and understood finally what Evelyn had been trying to accomplish. She'd been mapping futures, documenting possibilities, creating resources that wouldn't matter for decades, but would eventually enable human expansion beyond Earth's limitations. The work was lonely because it was ahead of its time, because contemporaries couldn't see value in questions that weren't yet urgent. But Evelyn had seen, had believed, had preserved everything carefully so that when the future arrived, someone would be ready. We need to make some calls tomorrow, Maya said, plans forming despite exhaustion. Contact space agencies, private companies, university research programs. Find out who wants this data and what they're willing to pay for it. And we need lawyers, good ones who understand intellectual property and scientific licensing. What about Celestial Properties? The people who wanted to buy the building? Maya smiled without humor. They can make a better offer if they're interested. We know what we have now. We're not selling for $950. They spent that night in the car again, parked beside the beam chamber, doors locked, but windows open to desert air that smelled of sage and possibilities. Maya couldn't sleep, mind racing through scenarios and calculations. Even the most conservative estimates suggested the data was worth several $1 million in licensing fees. Optimistic projections went higher, much higher, especially if multiple companies bid against each other for exclusive access. She thought about Lily's science project, about styrofoam balls and paint that had felt impossibly expensive 3 days ago. Thought about the warehouse job she'd never returned to, about the PhD she'd assumed was worthless, about the eviction notice that it seemed like the end of everything. Her grandmother had given her more than data. Evelyn had given her proof that work mattered, that persistence transcended immediate recognition, that building something valuable required believing it would matter even when no one else could see it. "Mom," Lily's voice came through darkness. "Are you awake?" "Yes, sweetie. Can't sleep." "Me either. I keep thinking about all those boxes. All that information great-grandma Evelyn saved. It's like she left us a treasure map to the moon." "That's exactly what she did. When we sell the information, can we keep some of it? Like, save copies so scientists can still use it?" The question surprised Maya with its thoughtfulness, its instinct toward preservation rather than pure exploitation. "Why would we do that?" "Because great-grandma Evelyn put it there for anyone who needed it. Not just for money, for science, for understanding stuff. It seems wrong to lock it away, so only rich people can see it." Maya felt something shift in her chest, pride mixing with recognition that her daughter understood something fundamental about value that transcended commercial calculation. Knowledge mattered because of what it enabled, not because of what it cost. Evelyn had secured the data in a vault not to hoard it, but to preserve it until people were ready to use it properly. "You're right. We'll license the data commercially to people who want to mine the moon or build bases there. But we'll also create an archive, make the information available to researchers and students who want to understand lunar geology. We'll do what your great-grandmother would have wanted. Make sure the work serves the purpose she intended." Morning brought clarity and cellular signal. Maya drove to the nearest town, bought a car charger and coffee and breakfast sandwiches that felt like luxuries after days of gas station snacks. While Lily ate in the car, Maya began making calls from a list she'd compiled during the sleepless night. First call, NASA's Lunar Resources Division, explaining that she had rare Earth element mapping data from the Moonbeam initiative, asking whether they'd be interested in evaluating it. The researcher who answered became immediately alert, transferred her to someone senior, who asked questions that confirmed the data's value. "We've been trying to reconstruct Moonbeam's research for years," the senior researcher said, voice tight with excitement. Dr. Wrench's work on Mare Tranquillitatis anomalies was referenced in a paper from 1973, but all supporting data was thought lost when the facility closed. If you have her original observation logs and analysis notes, that's extremely valuable historical research. More than historical, potentially applicable to current lunar mapping efforts. What would NASA consider appropriate compensation for access to this data? A long pause. "We need to evaluate the materials first, but preliminary licensing fees for this type of historical research data typically start around $2 million, depending on completeness and condition. If the data includes Dr. Wrench's rare Earth mapping work, that figure could be substantially higher. $2 million. Starting point." Maya's hand trembled as she thanked the researcher and ended the call. She sat in the parking lot, staring at her phone, trying to process numbers that exceeded anything she'd imagined. Second call, the law firm in New Mexico, informing them that she was declining Celestial Properties' offer and would be pursuing independent commercialization of the research data. The paralegals sounded pleased rather than surprised. "We suspected the property had more value than their initial offer suggested. The speed of their interest was telling. We can recommend intellectual property attorneys who specialize in scientific licensing if you need referrals. Please." Third call, her mother, Margaret, who hadn't spoken to Maya in 6 months after an argument about financial responsibility and life choices. The conversation started tense, remained difficult, but shifted when Maya explained what they'd found. Mom's research facility? But that closed decades ago. There was nothing left after decommissioning. That's what we were told. That's why the estate was so small. They removed modern equipment and left everything else, including 43 cases of research data that Mom carefully preserved. NASA thinks it's worth several $1 million in licensing fees. Silence stretched long enough that Maya checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Margaret's voice came back, thick with emotion Maya hadn't heard since her father died. She never told us, never said the work was valuable or that she'd secured anything. She just worked, and then the facility closed, and she died, and we thought it was all meaningless. It wasn't meaningless, Mom. It was just ahead of its time. More silence. Then I said terrible things about her. Told you she wasted her life on work no one cared about. Told you not to be like her, not to choose career over family stability. And now we understand she was building something that lasted. Building something that would matter when the world was ready for it. The intellectual property attorney Maya hired was named Sarah Okonkwo, a woman in her late 40s who specialized in scientific data, licensing, and had represented researchers in disputes with universities and corporations over patent rights and data ownership. She drove out to the facility 3 days after Maya's initial call, accompanied by a data preservation specialist and a historian who'd written extensively about Cold War aerospace research programs. They spent 6 hours examining the beam chamber vault's contents, photographing everything, documenting provenance, verifying that the materials were authentic and properly attributed to Dr. Evelyn Rinchey. The historian recognized Evelyn's handwriting from papers in university archives, confirmed that the research methodologies matched published accounts of Moonbeams' work, authenticated the materials as genuinely representative of the program's output. When they finished, Sarah sat with Maya on the facility's front steps while Lily played nearby, collecting interesting rocks and arranging them in patterns only she understood. "This is extraordinary," Sarah began, her voice carrying professional excitement tempered by legal caution. "The lunar resource mapping data alone is worth substantial licensing fees. But there's more here than commercial value. This represents a missing chapter in the history of American space exploration. Dr. Rinch's work directly informed NASA's understanding of lunar geology during the Apollo program era, but her contributions were never properly credited because the Moonbeam initiative operated outside traditional academic channels." What does that mean practically? It means multiple revenue streams. Commercial licensing to private space companies for resource extraction mapping. Historical archive licensing to museums and educational institutions. Academic licensing to universities conducting lunar geology research. And potentially sale of the facility itself as a historical landmark, though that would require federal designation processes that take time. Sarah pulled out a tablet, showed Maya preliminary valuation estimates that made the world tilt sideways. Conservative licensing projections, $8 to $12 million across all potential clients over 5 years. Optimistic projections, if bidding competition developed, $20 to $30 million. The facility and land, if designated as a historic research site, another $2 to $3 million to the Right Preservation Organization. "These are preliminary estimates," Sarah cautioned, "but they're based on comparable cases where historical scientific data prove commercially relevant to current research. Dr. Rinch's work is unique in that it's both historically significant and immediately applicable to current lunar exploration initiatives." Maya felt Lily's hand slip into hers, the small fingers squeezing with instinctive understanding that something important was happening. She looked at her daughter, at the beam chamber rising behind them, at the desert that had protected her grandmother's legacy for 53 years. "What's the first step?" "We contact everyone who might want this data. NASA, SpaceX, Blue Origin, university research programs, international space agencies. We create a licensing structure that allows multiple non-competing uses while preserving your family's ownership of the underlying research. And we make sure Dr. Rinchey gets the recognition she deserved but never received during her lifetime." The campaign to license Evelyn's research data began immediately. Sarah's firm handled outreach with the precision of people who understood that scientific data had value but required proper framing to attract serious buyers. They created a summary document explaining the Moonbeam Initiative's history, Dr. Rinch's contributions to lunar geology understanding, and the specific contents of the preserved research materials. Within a week, interest had exploded beyond Maya's capacity to manage alone. NASA's Lunar Resources Division sent a team to evaluate the materials in person. SpaceX's Lunar Program Director called personally to discuss exclusive licensing terms. A consortium of European space agencies submitted a preliminary offer for data access. Universities specializing in planetary geology requested archive copies for their research libraries. And Celestial Properties LLC submitted a new offer, $15 million for complete ownership of the facility, the land, and all research materials contained therein. The offer came with a 24-hour deadline and language emphasizing that this represented their final proposal. Maya met with Sarah in a hotel room in Alamogordo, Lily occupied with a tablet and headphones in the corner, to review the competing offers. The attorney spread documents across the bed, each one representing millions of dollars and different paths forward. Celestial Properties' offer is substantial, Sarah began, but it's also designed to scare you into accepting before you fully understand what you have. They want exclusive ownership because they've done analysis we're only beginning to understand. Their corporate filings show connections to rare earth element mining operations. They're not buying historical data. They're buying a head start on lunar resource extraction. Were they really offering compared to structured licensing? Sarah pulled up a spreadsheet. Their $15 million is immediate but complete. You'd receive payment and retain no future rights to the data or facility. Structured licensing, based on current offers, would generate approximately $8 million in the first year from NASA, SpaceX, and the European Consortium. Additional licensing to universities and museums would add another $2 to $3 million over 5 years. Future licensing as more companies enter lunar exploration could add substantially more. My projections suggest $20 to $30 million over a decade. So, I'd make more money by not selling to Celestial Properties. Significantly more, but there's also the historical preservation angle. If you sell to them, they'll likely strip the facility for commercial purposes and bury Dr. Wrench's contributions in corporate archives. If you maintain ownership and work with preservation organizations, your grandmother gets recognized for pioneering work that was dismissed during her lifetime. Maya looked at Lily, who'd taken off her headphones and was listening with the focused attention of children processing adult decisions that would shape their futures. What do you think, sweetie? Great-Grandma Evelyn didn't build this place so one company could own it. She built it for science. For everyone. We should do what she wanted. Sarah smiled with something approaching pride. She's right, and there's precedent for this approach. The Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico operated for decades as a public scientific resource while generating revenue through data, licensing, and research partnerships. We could structure something similar, maintain the facility as a historical site and research archive while licensing the data commercially to fund preservation and educational programs. The decision felt simultaneously obvious and terrifying. Maya had spent years struggling with poverty, accumulating debt, making choices dictated by immediate survival needs. The idea of turning down $15 million in favor of long-term revenue that might not materialize required a kind of faith she'd lost somewhere between divorce and unemployment. But she thought about Evelyn working alone in the desert, documenting data no one valued at the time, preserving everything carefully because she believed it would matter eventually. Her grandmother had taken the long view, had built for futures she wouldn't see, had chosen contribution over comfort. We declined Celestial Properties' offer, Maya said, hearing certainty in her voice despite the fear underneath. We structure licensing agreements that preserve the data's accessibility while generating revenue. And we work with preservation organizations to designate the facility as a historical landmark. Sarah's expression showed satisfaction that transcended professional success. I'll notify Celestial Properties and begin finalizing licensing terms with NASA and SpaceX. We should have contracts ready for signature within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt longer than the entire preceding month. Maya and Lily remained in New Mexico, staying in a modest hotel that felt luxurious after sleeping in a car, eating meals without calculating costs to the penny, allowing themselves to imagine futures that didn't require constant crisis management. Maya hired a property management company to secure the beam chamber facility, installing proper locks and environmental monitoring systems that would protect the remaining research materials until formal transfer to preservation organizations. She hired a genealogist to research Evelyn's life more thoroughly, uncovering details her family had never known or had chosen to forget. Dr. Evelyn Renshie had earned her physics PhD from MIT in 1952, one of only 3 women in her graduating class. She'd worked at Bell Labs in the late 1950s before joining the Moonbeam Initiative as principal investigator in 1968. Her research had been cited in 17 academic papers during her lifetime, modest recognition that hadn't translated to fame or tenure-track positions. She died in 1989 at age 61, alone in a small apartment in Santa Fe. Her contributions to lunar science largely forgotten by everyone except a few colleagues who remembered her work but couldn't overcome institutional indifference to resurrect its significance. The genealogist also uncovered something that explained Margaret's bitterness. Evelyn had left most of her small estate to scientific organizations rather than family, a final act of prioritizing research over personal relationships. Margaret had received $15,000 in life insurance, but felt the true inheritance. Her mother's time, attention, validation, had been given to work instead. Understanding this didn't excuse the harsh judgments Margaret had passed down, but it provided context Maya could finally comprehend. Her mother had been hurt by a parent who chose differently, who valued contribution over comfort, who believed scientific progress mattered more than individual feelings. And Maya had absorbed those judgments, had shaped her own choices in reaction against Evelyn's example, had avoided taking risks because taking risks meant potentially becoming the kind of person her mother had taught her pity. But now, holding documents that proved Evelyn's work had mattered tremendously despite delayed recognition, Maya could separate her grandmother's choices from her mother's pain, could see Evelyn as someone who'd made difficult decisions in impossible circumstances, who'd preserved what mattered despite institutional abandonment, who'd believed the future would be kinder than the present. The contracts arrived on a Monday morning, delivered via courier service with a gravity reserved for documents representing substantial sums. Sarah reviewed everything with Maya over video call, explaining each clause and condition, ensuring Maya understood exactly what she was agreeing to. NASA's licensing agreement. $5 million for exclusive access to lunar resource mapping data for 5 years, with options for renewal. The data would inform their Artemis program's landing site selection and resource utilization planning. Dr. Evelyn Renshie would be credited as primary researcher in all publications utilizing the materials, her contributions finally recognized by the institution that had benefited from them without acknowledgement. SpaceX's licensing agreement. $3 million for non-exclusive access to the same data, with additional fees for derivative research based on Evelyn's methodologies. They wanted the information to guide their Starship lunar landing, site, identification, and resource extraction feasibility studies. European Space Agency Consortium. $2 million for archive access and rights to incorporate the data into their lunar mapping projects. They were particularly interested in the water-ice location protocols, which suggested deposits in regions their current surveys had overlooked. University licensing agreements. Combined total of $800,000 from 6 institutions wanting to incorporate the materials into their planetary geology research programs and make the data available to students through properly attributed archives. The National Park Service had also submitted a proposal, designation of the Moonbeam facility as a National Historic Landmark, with a $1.5 million grant to fund initial preservation and conversion into a public museum and research archive. The facility would become the first lunar research program site protected under federal historic preservation laws, ensuring Evelyn's work remained accessible to future generations. Total revenue from the first year of licensing, $12. $3 million. Future projections, As more companies entered lunar exploration and additional research applications were identified, suggested ongoing income of $2 to $3 million annually. Maya signed the contracts with hands that trembled despite her attempts at steadiness. Lily stood beside her, witnessing the moment their lives changed from desperate to stable, from survival mode to actual future planning. Sarah witnessed the signatures via video call, her professionalism cracking slightly to reveal genuine satisfaction with an outcome that served justice as well as commerce. "Your grandmother would be proud," Sarah said when the last signature was complete. "This ensures her work survives and receives the recognition she deserved. And it provides your family with financial security while preserving public access to important scientific data." After the call ended, Maya and Lily sat in silence, processing what had just happened. $12 million. More money than Maya had imagined possessing in her lifetime. More security than she'd known since childhood. More possibility than desperation had allowed her to consider. "What do we do now?" Lily asked, the question encompassing everything and nothing. Maya thought about the eviction notice that had started this journey, about the warehouse job she'd abandoned, about the PhD she'd assumed was worthless, and the dreams she'd stopped allowing herself to have. She thought about the space museum Lily had wanted to visit, about styrofoam balls for science projects, about all the small deprivations that poverty imposed and wealth could eliminate. But more than that, she thought about purpose, about what Evelyn had built and why it had mattered, about legacy and contribution and the difference between survival and meaning. "We honor great-grandma Evelyn," Maya said finally. "We make sure people remember what she accomplished, and we figure out what we're supposed to build next." The news about the Moonbeam data discovery spread quickly through scientific communities and then to mainstream media. The story had everything journalists loved: forgotten woman scientist, hidden research facility, granddaughter discovering fortune in the desert, data that would guide humanity's return to the moon. Within days, Maya was fielding interview requests from major publications and documentary producers. She agreed to a few carefully selected interviews, working with Sarah to ensure the narrative focused on Evelyn's contributions rather than Maya's windfall. The New York Times ran a feature titled, "The Woman Who Mapped the Moon's Treasures Decades Before Anyone Cared." National Geographic contacted Maya about a documentary on pioneering women in space science, with Evelyn featured prominently. And academic institutions began requesting permission to name things after Dr. Evelyn Wrench. Research fellowships, laboratory spaces, lecture series. MIT, where she'd earned her PhD, announced plans for an annual lecture on planetary geology in her honor. NASA named their next lunar resources mapping satellite, the Wrench Observer. Margaret called after seeing the New York Times article, her voice thick with emotions Maya couldn't fully parse. "I didn't understand what she was doing. I thought she'd wasted her life on work that didn't matter to anyone. I told you not to be like her, and now we know she was right to focus on work that outlasted her. Mom, she gave us this. Not intentionally, not directly, but she preserved something valuable and made sure it would survive until someone needed it. I should have believed in her more. Should have defended her when other family members criticized her choices. Should have understood that contribution matters even when recognition is delayed." The conversation lasted an hour, Margaret apologizing for judgments she'd passed down, Maya accepting apologies she hadn't known she needed, both women grappling with the reality that Evelyn Wrench had been more complex and accomplished than family mythology had allowed. When they finally disconnected, Maya felt something settle that had been unsettled since childhood. Understanding about her grandmother, yes, but also understanding about herself. The PhD she'd earned wasn't wasted. The sacrifices she'd made for education and career development hadn't been mistakes. She'd been following Evelyn's example without knowing it, believing work could matter even when immediate circumstances suggested otherwise. The financial transfers processed with the speed of large institutional payments. NASA's $5 million arrived first, followed by SpaceX's $3 million, then the European Consortium's $2 million, then the staggered university payments and National Park Service grant. By mid-October, Maya's bank account contained sums that required her to read the balance multiple times to believe it was real. She paid off debts first: the credit cards, the medical bills, the legal fees from the divorce that had haunted her for years. Watched the balances drop to zero, felt weight lift that she'd carried so long it had become part of her physical experience of the world. Then she established trust funds for Lily's education, secured college funding regardless of what happened with the remaining money. Then came the harder question: what to do with wealth that exceeded immediate needs. Conventional wisdom suggested investment portfolios and financial advisors and careful wealth preservation strategies. But Maya kept thinking about Evelyn, about how her grandmother had used resources to build something that mattered rather than simply accumulating security. She established the Dr. Evelyn Rinchey Foundation for Women in Space Science, endowing it with $2 million to fund graduate fellowships for women pursuing planetary geology and astronomical research. The foundation's first announcement drew applications from 63 women researchers, each one describing work that Evelyn would have recognized and championed. She purchased a house in Alamogordo, nothing extravagant but permanent, with a yard where Lily could play and bedrooms that didn't feel temporary. She bought furniture that matched, kitchen equipment that worked properly, clothing that fit well and didn't come from discount bins. The ordinary comforts of middle-class existence felt revolutionary after years of poverty, and she accepted an adjunct position at New Mexico State University, teaching introductory astrophysics to undergraduates who reminded her why she pursued the PhD despite its cost. Being in a classroom again, explaining stellar evolution and gravitational dynamics, and the mathematics that described reality, felt like returning to herself after years of exile. Lily enrolled in a local elementary school, thriving in ways that stability enabled. She joined the science club, won a regional competition with her solar system model built from supplies Maya could finally afford, talked constantly about becoming an astronaut and following her great-grandmother's footsteps by studying places beyond Earth. The beam chamber facility's transformation into a National Historic Landmark took 8 months. The National Park Service funded structural stabilization, installed climate control systems to protect remaining equipment, created interpretive displays explaining Moonbeams' work and Evelyn's contributions. They preserved the ground floor operations room exactly as Maya had found it, down to the photograph on Evelyn's desk and the logbooks documenting her final observations. The facility opened to the public in June 2028, with a ceremony attended by NASA administrators, academic researchers, women scientists who'd been inspired by learning about Evelyn's work, and family members who'd finally understood what they'd dismissed for decades. Margaret stood beside Maya as speakers described Evelyn's pioneering research, tears streaming down her face as she confronted the mother she'd judged so harshly. Lily gave a brief speech, written herself with minimal adult editing, about discovering the facility and understanding why great-grandma Evelyn's work had mattered. She didn't build this place for herself, Lily said, her voice carrying clearly despite nervousness. She built it for all of us, for the people who would come after and need to know that the moon wasn't empty, that space wasn't useless, that looking up and looking far mattered even when other people said it didn't. The crowd, several hundred people gathered in the desert around the facility, erupted in applause. Maya watched her daughter shine, with confidence earned for being taken seriously, from understanding that she descended from someone who'd built important things, from believing her own dreams about space exploration were valid rather than childish fantasy. After the ceremony, Maya stood alone in front of the beam chamber, looking at the structure that had saved her life by existing precisely when she'd needed it, not through intention or planning, but through her grandmother's belief that preservation mattered, that work could transcend the person who created it, that futures were built by people willing to invest in outcomes they'd never see. A woman approached, older than Maya by perhaps 2 decades, wearing clothing that suggested academic employment and comfort. She extended her hand. Dr. Janet Willoughby. I worked with your grandmother briefly in 1973, just before Moonbeam closed. I was a graduate student studying radio telescope methodology, and she mentored me through my thesis research. I didn't know she mentored anyone. My family never talked about her work in detail. She mentored several women, quietly, without formal recognition. The field was hostile to women researchers in the 1970s. Evelyn created informal support networks, helped women access equipment and funding, provided references that carried weight despite coming from someone outside traditional academic structures. Janet pulled out a photograph, old but carefully preserved, showing Evelyn with 3 younger women in a laboratory setting. That's me on the left. Your grandmother helped all 3 of us complete our degrees and find positions in planetary science. Without her, I wouldn't have had a career. None of us would have. Maya studied the photograph, seeing her grandmother differently, not just as a solitary researcher obsessed with work, but as someone who'd understood that contribution meant lifting others, that building futures required helping people who came after, that legacy was measured in more than publications and patents. Thank you for telling me this. My mother thought she died alone because she'd chosen career over relationships. But she wasn't alone, was she? She was lonely sometimes, yes. The field was isolating for women. But alone? No. She built a community of women scientists who remembered her contributions and passed them forward. Every woman I've mentored in planetary geology, I've told them about Evelyn Rinchey, about building things that last, about believing your work matters even when institutions don't recognize it. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching visitors tour the facility, children pressing faces against windows to see the preserved equipment, adults reading interpretive displays with expressions suggesting they were learning things that reshaped their understanding of space exploration history. Maya felt Lily slip her hand into her own, felt Margaret move to stand on her other side. 3 generations connected by a woman whose choices had seemed cold, but were actually generous beyond immediate comprehension. Evelyn had given them more than data and property. She'd given them proof that work mattered, that persistence transcended recognition, that building carefully meant your contributions survived to serve purposes you couldn't predict. I'm proud of her, Margaret said quietly, the first time Maya had heard her mother say those words about Evelyn. I spent my whole life angry that she chose work over family time, but she was building this, building something that would matter when we needed it. That's not abandonment. That's the opposite. As evening approached and the ceremony wound down, Maya walked through the facility one final time before it officially transferred to National Park Service management. The equipment had been stabilized, the space transformed from abandoned structure to functional museum, but the essence remained. This was still the place Evelyn had built, still contained her decisions and priorities and beliefs about what mattered. In a ground floor operations room, Maya found the wooden box that had held Evelyn's personal papers, now empty but preserved as an artifact. She donated the letters and photographs to the museum, making them available to visitors who wanted to understand the human being behind the scientific achievements. But one item she'd kept, the final logbook entry, carefully framed and now hanging in her home office. Evelyn's handwriting, faded but legible, carrying forward across 50 years. Final observation run complete. Equipment powered down. Core samples and primary data logs secured in the beam chamber vault for future research. Coordinates logged. Access codes sealed. May whoever finds this understand what we were trying to accomplish. Maya traced the words with her fingertips, feeling connection across time and temperament. I understand, Grandma, and I'll make sure everyone else understands too. The Moonbeam facility became one of New Mexico's most visited historic sites, drawing space enthusiasts and students and researchers who wanted to understand early lunar science. The Dr. Evelyn Rinchey Foundation funded 15 graduate fellowships in its first year, helping women researchers pursue planetary geology studies that extended the work Evelyn had pioneered. And Maya continued teaching, returning to academia not as someone desperate for employment, but as someone who understood that education mattered, that helping the next generation meant investing in futures she'd never see, that contribution transcended personal comfort. On clear nights, Maya and Lily would drive out to the facility after it closed to visitors, using keys the Park Service had given Maya as Evelyn's descendant. They'd climb to the observation level and watch stars emerge, identifying constellations and planets, and the moon that had consumed Evelyn's professional life. "Do you think she knew?" Lily asked one night, her face pressed against the window that looked toward the Mare Tranquillitatis region Evelyn had studied so obsessively. That her work would matter this much? Maya considered the question carefully. Evelyn had preserved everything deliberately, had left coordinates and access protocols, had written that final logbook entry directed at future discoverers. She'd known something would survive. But had she understood how thoroughly her work would vindicate her choices, how completely the data would transform from historical curiosity to commercial necessity? "I think she hoped," Maya said finally. "I think she believed that careful work mattered even when recognition was delayed. And I think she would be proud that her research is helping humanity return to the moon and build things there. That's what she wanted, human expansion beyond Earth, informed by solid scientific understanding." "I'm going to be like her," Lily announced with the certainty of children who hadn't learned to doubt themselves yet. "I'm going to study space and discover things and build things that last." Maya pulled her daughter close, feeling gratitude for a grandmother she'd never truly known but who'd given them this. Not just money, not just security, but purpose and possibility and proof that contribution mattered across generations. "You're already like her, sweetie. You're curious and brave and willing to believe impossible things might be possible." That's exactly how she was. They sat in darkness, broken only by starlight, the beam chamber around them solid and permanent. Evelyn's legacy transformed from forgetting to remembrance. A woman who'd chosen difficulty and persistence, finally receiving recognition that arrived too late to thank her, but early enough to inspire others. The moon rose higher, illuminating the desert in silver light that made the landscape look alien and beautiful. Maya thought about the journey that had brought them here. Eviction notice to inheritance, desperation to stability, poverty to possibility, and understood that the real treasure wasn't the $12 million or the security it provided. The real treasure was understanding that work mattered, that building carefully meant your contribution survived, that choosing contribution over comfort was generous rather than selfish, that legacy was measured in what you enabled rather than what you accumulated. Evelyn Wrench had given them that understanding, had preserved it carefully in aluminum cases and logbooks in a facility designed to outlast her, had believed that someone would come who needed what she'd built, who would understand what she'd tried to accomplish, who would carry the work forward into futures she couldn't predict. "Thank you, Grandma," Maya whispered into darkness that felt less empty than inhabited by presence, by memory, by the certainty that some work transcended the people who created it and became larger than individual lives. The moon continued its arc across the sky, the same moon Evelyn had studied for 6 years, mapping resources no one valued until decades after her death. The same moon humanity was finally learning to value properly, informed by data a woman had collected alone in the desert, while institutions dismissed her work as impractical and funding dried up and recognition remained perpetually delayed. But Evelyn had persisted, had preserved, had believed, and 53 years later, her granddaughter and great-granddaughter stood in the facility she'd built, financially secure because she'd chosen contribution over comfort, inspired because she'd proven that difficult work mattered even when acknowledgement was delayed. "Come on," Maya said finally, standing and pulling Lily to her feet. "It's late. We should go home." Home. The word felt solid now, permanent, no longer a temporary arrangement subject to eviction and displacement. They had a house in Alamogordo, with Lily's room decorated with space posters and Maya's office filled with books about astrophysics and family photographs that now included Evelyn prominently. They had security and possibility and futures they could plan rather than simply survive. They had proof that persistence mattered and work transcended recognition and contribution was generous rather than selfish. They had everything Evelyn had given them by building carefully and preserving thoroughly and believing that someone would come who needed what she'd left behind. As they drove away from the beam chamber, Maya looked in the rearview mirror at the facility silhouetted against starlight. The structure stood exactly as Evelyn had built it, 53 years of weather and neglect unable to collapse what had been engineered to last. It would stand for decades more, probably centuries, testament to a woman who'd chosen to build rather than accept, who'd worked when institutions abandoned her, who'd preserved carefully because she believed the future deserved better than the present provided. Maya understood finally what her mother had never grasped and what she'd only learned through desperate discovery. Evelyn hadn't abandoned family. She'd invested in futures that included family she'd never meet, building resources that would matter when they were needed, contributing to human knowledge in ways that transcended personal recognition. That was love, not the comfortable kind that prioritized immediate emotional needs, but the difficult kind that built foundations for people who came after, that invested in outcomes you'd never see, that believed your work could matter beyond your lifetime. "I love you, Grandma Evelyn," Maya said quietly, knowing the words arrived too late to be heard but feeling necessary anyway. Lily, already half asleep in the passenger seat, murmured agreement. "Love you, Great-Grandma. Thank you for the moon treasure." Moon treasure. The phrase captured something essential about what they discovered. Not just data or money or property, but proof that looking up mattered, that studying distant places contributed to human expansion, that women could build things that lasted when they refused to accept limitations others imposed. The road home stretched through darkness, headlights illuminating small portions of landscape at a time. The journey requiring faith that the path continued beyond immediate visibility. Maya drove carefully, conscious of precious cargo, her daughter sleeping beside her, her grandmother's legacy preserved behind them, futures opening ahead that Evelyn had made possible by building something that outlasted her. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns unchanged since Evelyn had studied them, since humans first looked up and wondered what existed beyond Earth's boundaries, since someone first dared to believe that distant places could be mapped and understood and eventually reached. Evelyn Renshi had been one of those believers. Had spent 6 years in a desert facility analyzing radio signals bouncing off the moon, documenting resources decades before they mattered commercially, preserving everything carefully for someone who would come later and need what she'd built. That someone had been Maya, and now Maya understood her role. Preserve what Evelyn started, honor what she'd accomplished, carry the work forward into futures that remained open and possible. The moon treasure wasn't money. It was understanding. It was purpose. It was proof that contribution transcended recognition, that work mattered across generations, that building carefully meant your legacy survived to serve people you'd never meet. Maya drove home through darkness that felt less like absence and more like space waiting to be filled with possibility, with purpose, with the careful work of building futures someone else would inherit and carry forward. Behind them, the Moonbeam Lunar Research Initiative facility stood permanent against the desert, Dr. Evelyn Rensh's name carved into concrete that would outlast everyone currently alive, her work finally recognized, her contributions finally valued, her granddaughter finally understanding what she tried to accomplish all along. Building futures, preserving carefully, believing that work mattered even when recognition was delayed. That was the real inheritance. That was the treasure that transcended monetary value. That was what Evelyn had given them by choosing contribution over comfort and persistence over recognition and careful preservation over institutional approval. Maya carried it forward now, teaching students and funding researchers and making sure her grandmother's name remained attached to work that had mattered more than anyone understood during Evelyn's lifetime. The road continued forward into darkness that promised morning, into futures open and possible, into tomorrow waiting to be built by people who believed work mattered and contribution transcended recognition, and careful effort created legacies that survived across generations. They drove home, together, secure. purposeful, grateful, and somewhere in memory and starlight and the permanent structure rising from desert floor, Evelyn Wrench's work continued forward, preserved by granddaughters she'd never met but had provided for anyway, building futures she'd never see but had believed in completely. That was enough. That was everything. That was love expressed through contribution that outlasted the person who created it. They arrived home as midnight approached, carried sleeping daughter inside, locked doors against darkness that no longer threatened, and slept the dreamless sleep of people who discovered that work mattered and contribution transcended recognition, and careful preservation meant your legacy survived when you couldn't. The moon continued its arc across the sky, resources waiting to be claimed by humanity, finally learning to value what Evelyn Wrench had mapped decades before anyone cared, before anyone understood, before anyone believed. But she believed, had documented, had preserved, and 53 years later, her work was guiding humanity back to the moon, informed by data she'd collected alone in the desert while the world forgot her contributions. Until Maya found them, until recognition arrived, until Evelyn's name was finally attached to achievements that mattered more than institutional memory had allowed. Justice delayed, but not denied. Recognition late, but not lost. Legacy preserved by careful work that transcended the person who created it. 3 years after discovering the beam chamber, Maya stood in her office at New Mexico State University, reviewing grant applications from the Dr. Evelyn Wrench Foundation's 3rd annual cycle. The foundation had grown beyond her initial vision, now funding not just graduate fellowships, but also equipment grants for underfunded research programs and public outreach initiatives designed to inspire young women toward careers in planetary science. The applications this year numbered 97, each one representing a woman researcher whose work echoed Evelyn's in some way. Bold questions about distant places, methodologies that challenged conventional approaches, willingness to pursue knowledge despite institutional skepticism. Maya read through them with the careful attention her grandmother would have appreciated, looking for projects that combined scientific rigor with genuine curiosity about the universe. One application caught her attention immediately. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, yes, the same attorney who'd helped structure the original licensing agreements, had submitted a proposal that bridged law and science in unexpected ways. She wanted to establish legal frameworks for preserving scientific data from defunct research programs, creating protocols that would prevent future moonbeams from being lost to bureaucratic indifference and institutional memory failure. Maya approved the grant immediately, recognizing that preservation mattered beyond individual cases. How many other research programs had generated valuable data that subsequently disappeared when funding dried up? How many scientists had worked in obscurity, documenting discoveries that could have informed future research if proper archival systems had existed? Sarah's project would create those systems, working with universities and government agencies to identify abandoned research facilities, recover data before it degraded beyond recovery, and establish digital archives that ensured scientific work survived institutional transitions. It was exactly the kind of meta-level contribution that Evelyn would have championed, work that enabled other work, that built infrastructure for future discovery, that invested in outcomes the original researcher would never see. The phone on Maya's desk rang with the distinctive tone she'd assigned to family calls. Margaret's number appeared on the screen, and Maya answered with the easy affection that had developed between them as they'd processed Evelyn's legacy together. "Mom, what's happening?" "I'm at the facility. You need to come see this." Margaret's voice carried excitement that Maya recognized from previous discoveries. Small things usually, items in Evelyn's papers that revealed previously unknown aspects of her grandmother's life and work. But this sounded different, urgent in ways that suggested genuine significance rather than sentimental value. Maya grabbed her keys and drove the 40 minutes to the Moonbeams site, arriving to find Margaret standing with 2 National Park Service rangers near an area of the facility that had remained largely unexplored during the initial preservation work. The site's perimeter extended well beyond the beam chamber itself, encompassing several acres where support buildings had once stood and equipment had been tested before installation. We were doing geological surveys for the new interpretive trail, one ranger explained, gesturing toward ground-penetrating radar equipment. Standard practice before we dig foundations for signage. But we found something unexpected about 20 yards from the main structure. Looks like another sealed chamber, much smaller than the beam vault, buried approximately 6 feet down. Maya felt her pulse quicken. Buried intentionally? That's what the radar suggests. Concrete enclosure, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, sealed from above. Could be a storage cache, could be a bunker. We need permission from you as property trustee before we excavate. They began digging the following morning, Maya and Lily watching alongside Margaret and a small team of archaeologists the Park Service had brought in to ensure proper documentation of whatever they found. The New Mexico sun beat down relentlessly as excavators removed earth in careful layers, exposing concrete that had been poured decades ago and left undisturbed since. By noon, they'd cleared enough dirt to reveal a sealed hatch, heavy steel with a locking mechanism that had rusted but remained functional. The archaeologists photographed everything from multiple angles, documenting the seal's condition and the concrete surround construction before attempting to open it. When they finally broke the seal, cool air rushed out carrying the same scent of dust and preservation that Maya remembered from first opening the beam chamber. One of the archaeologists descended with proper lighting, spending several minutes surveying the space before calling up with barely contained excitement. "You need to see this. All of you." They climbed down one at a time into a space that revealed itself as a carefully constructed vault, roughly 8 feet square and 7 feet high, lined with metal shelving that held containers similar to those Maya had found in the beam chamber. But these containers were different, marked not with scientific notation, but with personal labels written in Evelyn's handwriting. Personal journals, 1968 to 1974 correspondence with David Patterson photographs, family and colleagues' research notes, classified material letters to future family. Maya's hands trembled as she lifted down the container marked for future family. Inside, wrapped in protective material that had kept everything dry and preserved, were sealed envelopes addressed to descendants Evelyn had never met but had hoped would eventually exist. The first envelope read, "To whomever manages my estate, please deliver to my granddaughter when she reaches adulthood." Maya opened it carefully, aware that everyone in the vault was watching, that this moment represented connection across 50 years of silence and misunderstanding. The letter inside was dated December 1973, written during the final year of the Moonbeam Initiative's operation. "Dear granddaughter, I'm writing this not knowing if you exist or will exist, not knowing if this letter will ever reach you or if it will simply decay in storage while bureaucracy forgets I lived at all. But I'm writing it anyway because some things deserve to be said even when there's no guarantee they'll be heard. By the time you read this, if you read this, I will likely be dead. I hope I lived long enough to meet you, to explain my choices in person, to show you the work I prioritized over family time, and help you understand why I made those decisions. But given the progression of my health issues and the statistical likelihood that I have perhaps 15 or 20 years remaining, the odds are against that possibility. So I'll explain now, in writing, preserve alongside the research data I've spent 6 years collecting. I chose this work not because I loved science more than family, though your grandmother Margaret believes that and has probably told you so. I chose this work because someone had to do it, and circumstances gave me the ability to be that someone. Women in my field face obstacles men don't encounter. Funding disappears when committees learn proposals come from female researchers. Collaboration invitations evaporate. Publication acceptance rates drop mysteriously when author names reveal gender. But Moonbeam was different. The funding came from private sources who cared about results more than researcher demographics. I could work without institutional oversight, without committees questioning whether a woman could handle technical complexity, without needing to prove constantly that I belonged in spaces designed to exclude me. So I worked. I documented lunar surface composition with methodologies I developed specifically for this facility. I mapped rare Earth element distributions that wouldn't matter commercially for decades, but would eventually guide human expansion beyond Earth. I preserved everything carefully because I knew institutional memory was fragile and research could be lost simply through administrative transitions and bureaucratic indifference. And yes, I sacrificed family time to do this. I missed holidays and birthdays and the ordinary moments that build relationships across generations. Your grandmother grew up with a mother who was physically present but emotionally elsewhere, focused on problems happening 238,000 miles away, while her daughter needed attention much closer. I regret that, not the work. The work matters and will continue mattering long after I'm gone. But I regret the pain my choices caused people who deserve better. I regret that Margaret learned to measure love through presence rather than contribution, through immediate attention rather than long-term investment. If you're reading this, you found either the beam chamber data or this vault or both. You've discovered that I preserved resources your generation will need, even though my generation couldn't value them. You've learned that careful work transcends recognition, that contribution matters across time scales longer than individual lives, that building foundations means investing in outcomes you'll never see. I hope you understand that this was love, not the comfortable kind that prioritizes immediate emotional needs, but the difficult kind that builds resources for people you'll never meet, that invests in human futures beyond your own timeline, that believes your work can matter more than your comfort. Use the data well. Honor the work by carrying it forward. And please, tell Margaret that I loved her even when I couldn't show it in ways she needed. Tell her that choosing one thing doesn't mean rejecting everything else. Tell her that contribution and connection aren't mutually exclusive, even though my life made them seem that way. Your grandmother, Evelyn Rinchi Maya, read the letter aloud, her voice breaking multiple times, aware that Margaret was crying quietly beside her. When she finished, they stood in silence that felt heavy with decades of misunderstanding finally resolved, with love expressed across generational divides that had seemed unbridgeable. She did love me, Margaret whispered finally. She just didn't know how to show it in ways I could understand. And I didn't know how to see love in forms that didn't match my expectations. They spent the rest of the day excavating the vault's contents, documenting everything before transfer to proper archival facilities. The personal journals revealed Evelyn's inner life, her struggles with institutional sexism, her excitement about scientific discoveries, her guilt about missing family events, her hope that the work would matter to someone eventually. The correspondence with David Patterson showed a professional partnership that had become genuine friendship, two researchers supporting each other through funding crises and political pressures, and the slow realization that their work was ahead of its time. The letters documented their decision to preserve everything carefully, their belief that future generations would value what their contemporaries dismissed. And the research notes, marked classified, contained information Maya hadn't expected. Evelyn had consulted on early NASA missions, providing analysis that informed Apollo landing site selections. Her contributions had been classified at the time, buried in documentation that credited institutions rather than individual researchers. But the notes prove her work had directly impacted humanity's first lunar landings, had guided decisions that shaped space exploration's foundational moments. She helped pick where Apollo landed. Lily breathed, reading over Maya's shoulder. Great-Grandma Evelyn helped astronauts get to the moon safely, and nobody ever knew. The revelation prompted Maya to contact NASA's historical archives, providing documentation that proved Evelyn's classified contributions. Within weeks, the agency announced plans to formally recognize Dr. Evelyn Rinchi's role in Apollo program planning, adding her name to the list of scientists whose work had enabled humanity's greatest exploratory achievement. The recognition came 60 years late, but it came. And with it came understanding that Evelyn's contributions had been systematically erased, not through malice, but through institutional practices that credited organizations rather than individuals, that made women's work invisible by default, that erased contributions through administrative procedures that prioritized hierarchy over accuracy. Maya organized a symposium at the facility, bringing together women scientists who'd faced similar erasure, whose work had been credited to male colleagues, or buried in organizational archives, or simply forgotten when funding ended and institutional memory reset. They shared stories that echoed Evelyn's experience. Brilliant research dismissed, contributions erased, careers constrained by gender-based limitations that male colleagues never encountered. But they also celebrated victories. The field had changed, slowly and incompletely, but changed nonetheless. Women now constituted 40% of planetary science PhDs, held leadership positions in major research programs, received Nobel Prizes and MacArthur Fellowships in recognition that Evelyn's generation had been systematically denied. We stand on foundations people like Dr. Rinchi built, one speaker noted during the symposium. She worked when institutions actively opposed women scientists. She preserved data when funding disappeared and colleagues moved on. She believed her work mattered even when no one acknowledged it. That persistence, that refusal to accept erasure, that careful preservation, it enabled everything that came after. The symposium concluded with an announcement that surprised even Maya. The International Astronomical Union was naming a crater on the moon after Dr. Evelyn Rinchi. A small crater in the Mare Tranquillitatis region, approximately 15 kilometers in diameter, located precisely where Evelyn's research had identified the anomalous density variations that had obsessed her final years at Moonbeam. Rinchi crater would appear on lunar maps for as long as humanity cared about the moon, a permanent memorial to a woman whose work had been temporarily forgotten, but ultimately proved essential. Maya stood at the podium accepting the honor on her grandmother's behalf, looking out at an audience that included Margaret and Lily and dozens of women scientists whose careers had been enabled by changes Evelyn's generation had fought for. "My grandmother built carefully," Maya said, her voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "She preserved thoroughly. She believed that work mattered across timescales longer than individual recognition cycles. And she was right. 50 years after she documented lunar resources that no one valued, her data is guiding humanity's return to the moon. Her methodologies inform current research. Her name appears on craters and facilities and fellowships." Maya paused, gathering thoughts that had been forming across 3 years of understanding her grandmother's legacy. But the real memorial isn't the crater or the facility or even the foundation that bears her name. The real memorial is every woman scientist who looks at Evelyn's example and believes her own work matters, even when institutions don't recognize it immediately. Every researcher who preserves data carefully because she understands that value transcends recognition timelines. Every person who chooses contribution over comfort, who builds for futures she won't see, who invests in outcomes that matter more than personal acknowledgement. That's what Evelyn gave us. Not just data, not just discoveries, but proof that persistence matters, that careful work survives institutional indifference, that contribution transcends the person who creates it. She built foundations we're still standing on. She preserved resources we're still discovering. She believed in futures she'd never see. And those futures are here now, grateful for the work she did when no one was watching. The applause that followed felt less like acknowledgement of Maya's words and more like collective recognition of something larger. A woman who'd worked in obscurity, who'd been dismissed and forgotten and erased, finally receiving the recognition she deserved all along. That evening, Maya and Lily and Margaret stood together at the beam chamber as sunset painted the desert in colors that made the landscape look alien and beautiful. The facility rose behind them, permanent now, protected by federal designation and public recognition and financial resources that ensured its survival for generations to come. "She's finally known," Margaret said quietly. "Finally understood. Finally valued the way she deserved." Maya nodded, but part of her wondered whether Evelyn would have cared about the recognition itself, or would have focused instead on whether the work continued, whether the data served its intended purpose, whether the foundations she'd built supported structures she'd never imagined. Recognition mattered because it corrected historical erasure, because it inspired others, because it proved that contributions survived even when institutions failed to acknowledge them. But the work itself, the careful documentation, the methodological innovation, the preserved data, that mattered more than any memorial or honor or posthumous award. Evelyn had known that, had chosen accordingly, had built something that transcended her name even while carrying her legacy forward. The moon rose over the desert, its surface marked now with a crater bearing her grandmother's name, a permanent memorial that would outlast everyone currently alive. Maya pointed it out to Lily, the small crater visible through binoculars, located precisely where Evelyn's research had suggested rare Earth elements existed in commercially viable concentrations. Rinchi Crater, Lily read from the astronomy app on her phone. 15.3 kilometers in diameter, located in Mare Tranquillitatis at coordinates that match Great-Grandma Evelyn's primary research focus area. First identified as geologically significant by Dr. Evelyn Rinchi in 1971, confirmed by subsequent lunar mapping missions in 2026. The description continued, summarizing Evelyn's contributions and the facility's historical significance, ending with words that captured something essential about legacy and contribution and work that mattered across generations. Dr. Rinchi's research, initially dismissed as impractical, proved foundational to current understanding of lunar resource distribution. Her methodologies informed contemporary planetary geology, and her commitment to data preservation ensured that knowledge survived institutional transitions that typically erase individual contributions. Rinchi Crater stands as permanent recognition of work that transcended immediate acknowledgement and continues informing human expansion beyond Earth. Maya closed her eyes, feeling connection across time and temperament to a grandmother she'd never met but finally understood. Evelyn had built this. Not just the data, not just the facility, but proof that careful work mattered, that contribution transcended recognition, that investing in futures beyond your own timeline was generous rather than selfish. Thank you, Grandma. Maya whispered into darkness that felt less empty than inhabited by presence, by memory, by the certainty that some work survived the people who created it and became larger than individual lives. Thank you for believing. Thank you for preserving. Thank you for building foundations we're still discovering. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns unchanged across millennia, the same stars humans had looked toward since consciousness first permitted wonder about what existed beyond immediate experience. Evelyn Rinchi had looked up, had studied those distant places with tools and methodologies she developed specifically for understanding things beyond reach, had documented what she found so carefully that it survived 50 years of institutional indifference. And now her name appeared among those stars, or at least on surfaces visible from Earth when moonlight caught the crater that bore her designation. Permanent recognition for temporary work that had proved more durable than anyone expected. They drove home through darkness, 3 generations connected by understanding that had arrived late, but completely, carrying forward work a woman had started alone in the desert when institutions dismissed her contributions and colleagues moved on to projects with better funding prospects. The road continued forward, illuminated only by headlights showing small portions at a time. The journey requiring faith that the path extended beyond immediate visibility into futures open and possible and built on foundations people like Evelyn Rinchi had created by refusing to accept that immediate recognition determined ultimate value. Maya drove carefully, conscious that she carried precious cargo, her daughter dreaming about astronaut careers, her mother finally at peace with a parent she'd misunderstood for decades, her grandmother's legacy preserved in documents and data, and daughters who understood what she'd accomplished. The moon followed them across the sky, marked now with a crater bearing Evelyn's name, a permanent memorial to work that had mattered more than institutions acknowledged, to contributions that survived erasure, to a woman who'd chosen carefully and built thoroughly and preserved everything because she believed someone would come who needed what she'd left behind. That someone had been Maya, and now Maya carried it forward, teaching and funding and preserving in ways that honored Evelyn's example, while extending it into futures neither woman could fully predict but both believed in completely. The road home stretched ahead, dark but navigable, unknown but possible, built on foundations laid by people who'd come before and maintained by people who understood that work mattered across generations, that contribution transcended recognition, that careful preservation meant legacies survived to serve purposes no one could anticipate. They arrived home, together, connected, grateful for a woman who'd worked alone but built for community, who'd chosen contribution over comfort, who'd preserved carefully because she believed the future deserved better than the present provided. Evelyn Wrench's work continued forward, carried by granddaughters she'd never met, but had provided for anyway, guided by principles she'd demonstrated through choices that had seemed cold but were actually generous beyond immediate comprehension. The moon rose higher, crater barely visible but permanently present, memorial to work that mattered, contribution that survived, legacy preserved by a woman who'd refused to accept that immediate recognition determined ultimate value. They slept peacefully, 3 generations sharing space and understanding, connected by a woman who'd built foundations they were still discovering, who'd preserved resources they were still accessing, who believed in futures that had finally arrived, grateful and ready to carry the work forward into tomorrow, waiting to be built by people who understood what Evelyn had known all along. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.